Thank you, Charlotte, for that wonderful introduction, and thank you, everyone, for spending part of your Saturday here to learn a little bit about Silver Spring history that doesn't appear in very many books or public documents. So to expand a little on what Charlotte introduced you to, I'm finishing a book on erasure, displacement, and gentrification in Decatur, Georgia, which is an Atlanta suburb. We moved to Decatur in early 2011, and we moved into a neighborhood that's now known as Oakhurst, which is the southwest quadrant of the city of Decatur. Very soon after we moved in, we began noticing houses being torn down and U-Hauls appearing in front yards, carting off the belongings of the African American residents who lived in the small houses. The small houses were typically torn down in a day or two and replaced by substantially larger homes, McMansions, for oftentimes wealthier, whiter people moving into the city of Decatur. I began asking questions about what's going on with the housing, why is this happening at such an accelerated rate, where are the people going, and what's the history of this community? And it became pretty clear that Decatur is unlike any other place in the United States for a few reasons I'm going to get into in a moment. But Decatur, during the time that we spent time in the city, 11 months we lived there, we saw homes being sent to landfills. We saw schools, in this case, the city's two segregation era black schools, a high school and an elementary school, sent to landfills. We saw public housing, historic public housing, sent to landfill and redeveloped. And we saw churches sent to landfills and redeveloped, in this case for high-end luxury townhomes. So in my research into Decatur, Decatur likes to bill itself as a liberal, progressive, sustainable community, words that are fairly familiar to folks who have lived in Silver Spring and Montgomery County for any length of time. And Decatur has a unique history in that, in addition to being a deep South town, it also has the honor, if you will, of being the only place in the United States that had a Tuesday through Saturday school week specifically to keep Jews out of the city limits. And this went on for 30 years in the 20th century. Decatur is also the only place in the United States where Dr. Martin Luther King was taken into custody by the police and whisked to a state prison. So with these bits of history coming to the forefront as I was digging into what was going on in my neighborhood, I was also learning about the history of race and displacement in the city of Decatur. So Decatur, even though it's a small city, 4 square miles, 22,000 or so people, between 1980 and the first decade of the 20th century, Decatur lost almost 2/3 to 3/4 of its black population, mostly due to displacement, gentrification-driven displacement. Decatur has a long history of gentrification cycles going back to the mid-1970s when the city became one of the first pilot urban homesteading cities in the United States. HUD created this program where people could go into distressed communities with large numbers of vacant and foreclosed homes, buy them for $1, get low interest rehabilitation loans, and then the theory was the community would become more stable as these people were moving in. That didn't work in Decatur, and several more gentrification cycles took place between the mid-1970s and today, leading to this hemorrhaging of the black population shown in the two slides there. By the time we left Decatur and moved back here in late 2014, I had amassed several dozen oral history interviews, several file cabinets full of documentary research, photographs, and a database of more than 100 homes torn down within this less than 1 square mile area between 2011 and 2014 that forms the core of my book. I also brought with me a substantial amount of information on how Decatur constructs its history and historic preservation, what gets saved, what gets remembered, and what doesn't. So looking at Decatur's historic preservation documents, for example, in 2009, the city hired a consultant to photograph every building in the city, write a history of all the neighborhoods, recommend properties for designation in the local historic preservation law and in the National Register of Historic Places. Decatur was founded in 1823, deep South city, right on the edge of Atlanta, The words black and African American didn't appear once in any of that historic resource survey. So according to the city of Decatur and its official planning documents, there are no blacks living in Decatur now, and by extension, the African Americans don't have any history or historic places. By the time we left, the only place to find black history in Decatur, Georgia is mediated by whites and under glass at the Beacon Municipal Center, that site that formerly was the location of the two equalization schools, the segregation era schools in the city. So when we moved back to Silver Spring, I wanted to collect comparative information on another suburb, another inner ring suburb that had a very similar development history to Decatur, because I wanted to ensure that what I was going to be writing about Decatur was reproducible, that was based on valid facts, not on my empirical impressions of what I'd seen happening there over the short time that I'd spent there. So I dug into Silver Spring's histories. I dug into published books, the community's historic preservation documents published by the Montgomery County Planning Department, and items put out in the media. And curiously, Silver Spring was a lot like Decatur. So for example, these three volumes, two privately published, one published by the Silver Spring Historical Society, and then the Historic Resources Survey of the Silver Spring Central Business District, commissioned by the Planning Department. Just like Decatur, the words black and African American don't appear anywhere. By extension, there are no blacks and African Americans who contributed to Silver Spring's history. Didn't sound right. So I came to Lintonsville to find black history, because when I started asking questions about where I could find black history here, everyone said, you have to go to Lintonsville. That's where you find black history in Silver Spring. Yet, if you look at this real estate map from 1933, published by a group of partners allied with E. Brooke Lee, whom we'll hear about in a moment, the space we're at right now is blank. 1933. By that time, there had been people living here for several decades. There were houses, there were streets, there was a history, there was mappable space, yet it's blank. You know, 1933, that's an awful long time ago. 2012, there's that same area. Here's where we are today, right now. Again, blank space. This is a map based on work done by the Silver Spring Historical Society and reproduced by a local publication, the Tacoma Voice. Not only is Silver Spring erased, but the authors of this map extended the Woodside community into Lintonsville's space, fully erasing the community's history. So after a few months of trying to dig into the documentary history and identifying people to interview about what was going on with our history here in Silver Spring, it became clear that there is a very complicated way history is constructed here. And to deconstruct that history, you have to look at the three modes of production of history in Silver Spring. First of all, there's the romantic Silver Spring. That's the legend that everyone's familiar with, that Francis Preston Blair and his daughter were riding a horse one day and discovered this mica-flecked spring in the 1840s. The second Silver Spring is the entrepreneurial Silver Spring. That's a Silver Spring that was created by 20th century community boosters, mostly real estate speculators, who wanted to create an all-white, middle-class suburb for Washington, D.C., where people flooding to the area to work in the federal government and the military could find a safe, secure, comfortable home. The third Silver Spring is the nostalgic Silver Spring. That's the Silver Spring you find in publications and maps like this. It presents a very warm and fuzzy picture of the community that celebrates the white supremacists who created these spaces, who built the downtown business district, who mapped and built the residential subdivisions that fill our space. But it's not an accurate history, and it's certainly not a history that celebrates the many accomplishments of the African Americans whose hands and backs actually built Silver Spring, the buildings that now comprise the downtown area and many of the homes. So a very quick reminder of this nostalgic Silver Spring. It begins at the Silver Spring itself in South Silver Spring, Acorn Park. There's Francis Preston Blair, who came to Washington, D.C. from Kentucky to run a newspaper and ultimately became part of Abraham Lincoln's inner circle. A lot of celebratory items ringing the Silver Spring, telling that nostalgic story of Blair and his daughter finding the Micaflex Spring and the wonderful things they did over the next several decades to make this space a unique, what we now know as a diverse, liberal, inclusive community, or so we think. But that nostalgic history doesn't tell the full story about Francis Preston Blair. Blair was one of the largest enslavers in Montgomery County. When this 1860 census was taken, he had 15 enslaved people living in 4 slave houses on his farm. Local historians call it a farm or a summer residence. Other historians might be more inclined to call it a plantation. So when Abraham Lincoln went into the White House, he went in as a Republican. After his assassination, many of the people who affiliated themselves with Lincoln and the Republican Party ran right back to the Democratic Party, to segregation, and to all of the things that produced a society that relied heavily on enslaved labor to build what we call the United States. Not only did Francis Preston Blair and his kin go back to the Democratic Party and re-embrace segregationism, they didn't like slavery, but they didn't like living with black folks either. So they joined what was called the colonization movement. They figured, if we're going to have free people of color, let them go live somewhere else. Let them go live in the Caribbean, South America, or back in Africa, but don't let them live near us. Silver Spring is what I call a sundown suburb. You might have heard the term Sundown Town. It was popularized by the sociologist and historian Jim Loewen and his book of the same name, Sundown Towns. These were places, many of them in the northern United States, that had very rigidly established spatial policies that prohibited African Americans from being within the corporate limits after dark, hence the name Sundown Town. If you were caught there after dark, bad things would happen to you. You could be arrested, you could be beaten, you could be killed. In fact, I've interviewed people who grew up in Northwest Washington and lower Montgomery County in many of the African American communities, and they tell the same story about what we know now as Silver Spring. Don't get caught here after dark. Bad things would happen to you. But Silver Spring isn't an incorporated city. It's an unincorporated area in what used to be rural part of Montgomery County. So we didn't have corporate limits where they could put signs up on the edge telling blacks to be gone after dark, but there were other tools that the whites who founded Silver Spring used to essentially keep this an all-white community well into the Cold War period. So some of the tools used elsewhere in the United States, and these are some examples from Decatur, Georgia, were racial zoning. So starting in the second decade of the 20th century, cities throughout the United States, starting with Baltimore, began creating zoning laws specifically telling folks which blocks were for whites, which blocks were for blacks, and that was it. You lived within that space that was defined. The Supreme Court overturned that process in 1916, and real estate speculators, community officials found other ways to exclude African Americans from their spaces, and you're familiar with many of them today: redlining, racial restrictive covenants, and other tools. This is an example from nearby Prince George's County. This is the North Brentwood barrier. You'll notice this is a perfectly serviceable street. On one side you have nice mid-20th century suburban homes, and behind me, if I were looking in the opposite direction, you'd find homes just like those. But there's this barrier in the street. There's no sign saying, don't be found here after sundown. North Brentwood was the first municipality in Maryland created for African Americans and by African Americans in the 1920s. Brentwood, on the other hand, didn't want African Americans as part of their community. So there are no firm dates that I know of when these barriers first appeared, but based on my experience with other cities and communities in the United States, they probably went up right after Brown v. Board in the 1950s. And they're still there today. I shot that photo just a few weeks ago. It's a thorny part of the community's history. Another way that community builders in Silver Spring and elsewhere used to keep their communities all white was to create what were called restricted subdivisions or restricted home developments. This is a subdivision sign for the North Gate subdivision, which was created by E. Brooke Lee's North Washington Realty Company. This captures perfectly what folks seeing driving along Georgia Avenue or Colesville Road or any of the other large streets in our area would see, telling them that this was going to be an all-white space for them to buy a home, live, raise a family, and be happy ever after. You'll see in these ads for subdivision homes throughout Silver Spring some of the same language, a highly restricted section, protecting restrictions that will be rigidly enforced. That was code for all white. And you would find language like this in advertising for subdivisions throughout Washington and Montgomery County for much of the 20th century. So what were these racially restrictive covenants? Here's an example of one from the first known use in Montgomery County, creating a subdivision, Silver Spring. What do you know about that? So in Silver Spring, which was created by a South Virginia lawyer, real estate speculator who decided to get in on the land boom here at the turn of the 20th century, he was selling pieces of property that he carved out of a very large farm that he bought. And the people buying these lots were not able to sell to anyone whose death rate or people of African descent whose death rate was greater than the white race. And he went through a laundry list of reasons why it would be bad for the health and for the financial future of the community. So that was the start of the use of racial restrictive covenants in Silver Spring and Montgomery County in the early 20th century, 1904. Let's fast forward a couple of decades to 1926 and Cecil's addition to Silver Spring. And in this one, fairly large area here, the buyers of homes in this subdivision affirmed that for the reasons of sanitation and health, neither the grantee, her heirs, or assigns shall or will sell, grant, lease, rent, or convey the said premises to any person of a race whose death rate is higher than that of the white race. Or Indian Spring Club Estates, which curiously enough was developed by a Jewish developer who himself might have found himself the subject of ethnically restrictive subdivisions in Washington and elsewhere in Montgomery County. His properties said, no person of any race other than the Caucasian race shall use or occupy any building or lot except that this covenant shall not prevent occupancy by domestic servants. So basically, in all of these properties, the only way you could live in them if you were a person of African descent is if you were a maid, gardener, or otherwise employed by the owner. I'm going to go a little farther west in Montgomery County to Bethesda and the Sumner subdivision created by the WC&A and Miller Development Company. These guys wanted to be sure that not only blacks were kept out, but everybody who wasn't a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant kept out. So folks who were Negroes or any person of or persons of Negro blood or extraction, or any person of the Semitic race, blood, or origin, which racial description shall be deemed to include Armenians, Jews, Hebrews, Persians, and Syrians. And again, if you're domestic servants, you're more than welcome to live there. You might think that the Miller Company is part of a long-forgotten, discarded past. I shot that last year. The Miller Company is still in business. They were so notorious among civil rights groups in the 1950s and 1960s that when they pursued urban renewal contracts in Washington, D.C., people from all sorts of civic organizations went to testify before Congress to ensure that they didn't get these lucrative government contracts. So how much of Silver Spring was covered by racially restrictive covenants? There's an idea. So what I did is I took what's called a GIS layer, and I platted all of the subdivisions created between 1900 and 1948, the year the Supreme Court ruled racially restrictive covenants unenforceable in the courts. And I went through and identified which ones had racially restrictive covenants and which ones didn't. All of these red areas are spaces where African Americans simply could not live unless they were domestic servants. There are a couple of notable exceptions here. These darker purplish areas are subdivisions that were platted that didn't have racially restrictive covenants attached to them, but by and large, Silver Spring, by the mid-20th century, was a sundown suburb. How did the sundown suburb come to be? E. Brookley. E. Brookley was a descendant of Francis Preston Blair. He was a former Maryland Secretary of State, served in the Maryland State Legislature, and he served in World War I, came back to Montgomery County, founded a real estate business in the 1920s, founded a newspaper in the 1920s, founded the Silver Spring Chamber of Commerce in the 1920s, and began marketing this area that we now know as this amorphous, unincorporated Silver Spring as Maryland north of Washington, an ideal place where people flowing into the Washington area could buy wonderful homes free of any African Americans to ruin things for them. So for several decades, starting in the 1920s through the 1940s, multiple subdivisions were created. Again, those areas in red that I showed you a little while ago, that were targeted to middle-class white homeowners moving to Washington. In this case, the clever subdivider decided to market this home to the bachelor girl, a woman coming to Washington to work as a clerk, perhaps for the Navy Department or some other federal agency. Very specifically targeted and lots of curb appeal. Not to be limited to the single woman coming to Washington, this is the bride's home. Again, moving up in the life cycle here, targeted specifically for a young married couple, all of the amenities necessary, washer, dryer, full modern kitchen, and of course garage for the cars. Sometimes subdividers in Montgomery County weren't satisfied with the best in new architecture, in new appliances, and all the goodies that go inside the house. They had to give you a car to make it more appealing, and maybe they'll throw in a radio too. So there's a historic district in Garrett Park known as the Chevy Houses, where new buyers got a bungalow home, a radio, garage, and a car. Racially exclusive space wasn't limited to single-family homes in Silver Spring and Montgomery County. Falkland Apartments was one of several multifamily communities developed in the 1930s and 40s throughout Silver Spring that continued that tradition of separate and very unequal by only allowing whites to rent properties with them. When the Falkland Apartments went up for historic designation in the 1980s, folks who tried to get apartments there, people of African descent, told the press and told county leaders that, we don't really have much attachment to these places because they wouldn't let us live there. There were vacancies, but no blacks need apply. And it wasn't just the Falkland Apartments. This apartment complex across the street from the former City Place, developed again by Jewish developers, and we're going to hear a little more about them in a moment, appealing to the large number of folks moving to Washington. There was a housing shortage for certain groups of people working in the defense industries, people of African descent, people who couldn't afford to buy one of these fancy FHA backed mortgage homes. So they moved into apartment communities like this. Montgomery Arms Apartments, completed in 1941 by a consortium of Jewish developers. Again, I don't know when the first blacks moved into that apartment complex, but it most likely didn't happen until after 1968 or 1969. It's another historically designated property in Montgomery County. Then we have the Silver Theater. And the Silver Theater is a well-loved building in downtown Silver Spring. It's lovingly restored using local tax money, using historic preservation tax credits, I believe. And it's a popular gathering space for public programs. Yet, unlike other places like Washington, D.C., Alexandria, Silver Spring's two historic movie theaters didn't have segregated spaces. There wasn't a roped off area or a balcony where blacks could go to see movies. The whites who owned these businesses simply didn't want black money at all. So Charlotte Caulfield, who did the honor of introducing me, remembers well the Silver Theater and the violence that it did to the people who lived in the homes surrounding the space we're in now. So where did African Americans go to dance, to see movies, to hear music? Well, one of the places, and again, you won't find this in any of the history books, is the Hefner Recreation Building in Tacoma Park. In the mid-1950s, Tacoma Park, you have this great vision of Tacoma Park being liberals and Birkenstock wearing granola types. Well, Tacoma Park was just as segregated as the rest of Montgomery County in the American South, and it had a couple of clusters of African American communities within its corporate limits. In the early 1950s, city leaders decided to build a new municipal works facility in the middle of one of these black communities at the intersection of Geneva and Ritchie Avenues. Were it not for some very vocal African American residents, one of whom became a very popular civic leader, Lee Jordan, the city would have made the first significant strides in erasing the community. They did build the municipal works facility where trash trucks, street repair trucks, and other things roll through the historic black neighborhood, but it's not as extensive. And one of the concessions that the African American community got from the city of Tacoma Park was to build the Hefner Park Recreation Center, where after it opened in the late 1950s, blacks from all over Northwest Washington and lower Montgomery County would congregate because they weren't welcome in places like the Silver Spring Armory, the Silver Theater, the Roth Theater, or any of the other public spaces that catered to Silver Spring's white communities. So I've told you about where the white folks lived in Silver Spring. Let's go to the neighborhood we're located now, Lintonsville, which quite literally was Silver Spring's other side of the tracks. Lintonsville is one of, in Montgomery County, 60 or more hamlets and urban neighborhoods that began developing in the years just before the Civil War and that really took off during Reconstruction as all black hamlets or neighborhoods. I've begun calling this area on each side of the DC-Maryland border the Washington or DC-Maryland black borderlands, because all of these communities in the shaded area were interconnected. They were related by kinship, by church affiliation, entrepreneurship, and baseball. So all of these people were either related by blood, marriage, or social affiliations. Here's Lintonsville right here, right sort of in the center, and then very closely aligned with Lintonsville is the Pines, which was settled by black landowners in the late 1870s. The Reno community in Northwest Washington, which is now Tenleytown. River Road, which is the area that's now occupied by industrial uses and where the cemetery you might have been reading about over the past couple of years is located. And then a few other lesser known ones like Hawkins Lane, Kengar, and Wheaton Lane, just off of University Boulevard between Four Corners and downtown Wheaton. Little closer view of some of these communities. Wheaton Lane, founded by folks whose names appear in land records and maps throughout the black borderlands. Names like Gassaway, Hyson are very common. The Pines, that little community that straddles the Maryland DC line down near Grub Road. So if you drive down Grub Road, just take a left out of here, keep on going down to Grub Road, you'll see at the DC line a fake well on the right-hand side. That's generally the area where the Pines was, and oral histories indicate that there were very close familial associations with the folks who came to settle in Lintonsville around the turn of the 20th century and the people who lived in the Pines. And then Kengar and Scotland, all essentially very similar communities with very similar histories of African-American land ownership, and then resilience, resistance, and ultimately displacement and erasure. Lintonsville was founded in 1853 by Samuel Linton. Samuel Linton was a free man of color who worked for Francis Preston Blair in the 1840s. He married someone, I think, who was enslaved in the Blair household in the 1840s. He married her in 1849. By 1853, Linton had sufficient capital to buy 4 acres in the general space we're at now, and he spent the next 4 decades there raising a family, farming the land, and creating a space that he started to sell to other African Americans. George and Mary Washington bought that small parcel in 1890. That was the only parcel that Linton, that we know of, gave up. He willingly sold that piece of property to them. In 1891, the B&O Railroad came through and wanted to condemn some of Linton's property to build the new Georgetown branch freight railroad that connects the main line to Georgetown and Washington, D.C. Linton was one of a handful of property owners who said, no, you're not taking my land. You want my land? We're going to go to court. They went to court, settled. Railroad had the right of eminent domain in Maryland ever since its creation in the 1820s. So the railroad was built through Linton's land, and this is one of the earliest maps actually showing the general physical layout of Linton's property. He died in 1893. At the time, his wife and one of his daughters was still living on the property. They immediately ran into financial troubles, and his widow sought some financial relief from a mortgage company based in Richmond, Virginia. This company, like many you can read about today, preyed upon African American homeowners throughout Montgomery County and throughout Delaware, Virginia, giving them mortgages that they knew couldn't or wouldn't be repaid, and the land would be seized, sold for a higher value, and converted for use, oftentimes to white landowners. That's what happened to Samuel Linton's property in 1895. His widow and daughter couldn't make the mortgage payments. It was foreclosed upon, sold it at sheriff's auction in Rockville, and the property was bought by a Washington, D.C. attorney named L. Cable Williamson, who then subdivided it into these lots that were then mostly rented out to African Americans for the next several decades after about 1901. But by that time, Lintonsville was already a cohesive, firm African-American hamlet. There were 2 churches affiliated with Lintonsville by that time, at least 1 school, at least 1 fraternal organization, the Eastern Star Fraternal Organization, and then lots of family homes, many of them occupied by renters, but some of them ultimately occupied by owners. These weren't the homes that you saw in the real estate ads from the 1930s and 1940s, nicely designed speculator homes. These were vernacular, ordinary homes that people of a wide array of economic backgrounds, religious backgrounds, owned, occupied, or rented. Montgomery County didn't think these were necessarily nice homes, but if you talk to the folks who lived in Lintonsville, their homes were their castles. As I said, Lintonsville had a fairly substantial social network tied to the other African American communities, and these are some photos courtesy of Charlotte Cofield showing some of the highlights of the community. When you read about places like Lintonsville, you only read about the bad things, the fact that urban renewal happened here, or that there were a whole lot of poor people who happened to live here. Well, these photos clearly don't show a whole lot of poor people breaking the law and doing other bad things that Montgomery County said they did. A couple of more shots of typical life in Lintonsville in the mid-20th century. By the turn of the 20th century, Lintonsville had become Silver Spring's other side of the tracks. There were 2 railroads by that time that bordered the community and split the community. By 1902, 1903, Lintonsville was known as Monkey Hollow. It was a pejorative label applied to the community, in which recapitulated names found in other black communities in the Washington and Montgomery County area. So for example, Lintonsville was Monkey Hollow. Rockville had an African American community that whites called Monkey Run. Whites would call other spaces in Northwest Washington and Bethesda Crow Hill, and none of these places had monkeys living in them or had large numbers of crows, warranting the toponym or place name. Yet that's what whites called these places. And you can actually see in this 1910 population census the legal name of the space we're in now, Linden, and then in parentheses, Monkey Hollow. So even the US Census taker thought this was a place not worthy of respect like other communities in Montgomery County. So here we have first decade of the 20th century, 1910, and then let's fast forward to 1976 and the release of the Rocky movie. Sylvester Stallone spent a good chunk of his childhood in this area, and he did a lot of TV and a lot of newspaper interviews after Rocky took off as a successful movie. And when folks living in Lintonsville began reading those interviews and listening to them on the television or radio, they'd hear him describe this as Monkey Hollow. A lot of would-be Sylvester Stallone fans who suddenly became Sylvester Stallone haters for good reason. So the other side of the tracks, you're probably familiar with that trope in American popular culture. You know, bad things happen on the other side of the tracks. Where does that stigmatization of space come from? Well, it comes from several places. It comes from giving a place an ugly name like Monkey Hollow. It comes from what's called expulsive zoning, creating spaces in a municipality or other place where the government encourages the development of nuisance industries. So in 1944, Montgomery County decided to build one of 2 trash incinerators in Lintonsville. Montgomery County then decided to place its animal control shelter in Lintonsville. In the late 1940s, let's see, I have another slide in a moment. 2 radio towers were constructed on the edges of Lintonsville, all intended to create an ugly, uninhabitable place that whites thought African Americans wouldn't want to live. They'd move and convert it to wealthier and whiter uses. Now you might think, that's just conspiracy theory bunk. Well, in 1923, a real estate evaluator actually came through this area. Get a quick drink. And wrote about all of the development possibilities in Silver Spring and the neighboring suburbs up and down the B&O Railroad line. When the evaluator got to Lintonsville, here's what he wrote. An area of cheap Negro residences, ideal for country estate development or suburban expansion. So as early as 1923, whites in Montgomery County were conceiving of this space not as an African American community, but as a space where white suburbanization can overflow and replace the African Americans living here. So here's a shot of those 2 broadcast towers. One of them is still in place. Had one on one side of Brookville Road and the other on the site of what's now the Paddington apartment complex. By the 1940s, communities throughout the United States were resisting the placement of large broadcast towers, and they had the political capital to say, no, you're not going to build that here. People in Lintonsville didn't have that political capital, so we still see evidence of that expulsive zoning in the industrial uses on Brookville Road and the surviving broadcast tower at WWDC. Stigmatization also makes it easier to erase communities. So if all you have are drunken monkeys committing murders, gambling, and doing other things, there's no harm in erasing them, in pursuing urban renewal. And that's precisely what Montgomery County did starting in the 1960s. Lintonsville became Montgomery County's top urban renewal priority project. What's curious about Montgomery, whoops, don't want to do that. What's curious about Montgomery County's urban renewal maps, they called them the Community Renewal Program, using the same batch of money and same rules that urban renewal in places like Washington, Philadelphia, and New York used. What's curious about Montgomery County's is instead of inner city neighborhoods, these are all mostly African American hamlets. Those same hamlets that developed starting around the years just before the Civil War and accelerating in development during Reconstruction. So just looking at where these are located, if the housing, the homeowners loan corporation redlining maps created in the 1930s survived for the Washington metropolitan area, I suspect you'd find a nice one-to-one correlation with many of these communities with the areas redlined, deemed unsuitable for white investment and habitation. So starting in 1969, when the County Council approved urban renewal, things started progressing here very quickly. Before that time, Lintonsville had no paved streets. Lintonsville had no sewer, had no running water. Many people living here toted water from a spigot they had to pay the WSSC for down on Brookville Road. Some families had springs. It was a mixed bag of resources. The railroads provided many families with scavenged coal to heat homes and cook. This is an image just on the edge of Lintonsville's disintegration. You can see the new Claridge House apartments rising behind one of the remaining African-American vernacular homes here. If you notice, fence knocked down in legal dispute. This newspaper article from 1967 has some counterparts in the 21st century. For those of you who know about the Farm Road community up in the Sandy Spring area, when Montgomery County allowed a developer to subdivide the land and build a large new subdivision there, the developer put a fence across the Farm Road, leading to a series of African-American farms that formed one of these Reconstruction era hamlets. You find this throughout Montgomery County's history, starting in the late 1940s, where African-American property rights were regularly abused and ignored, and fences put up simply to keep people out of their spaces. So we have a fairly good introduction to Silver Spring in Montgomery County as an area dominated by segregation and Jim Crow, and spaces occupied by proud African Americans who built resilient, enduring communities. Civil rights didn't come easy to Montgomery County, and it came in ways that mirror developments in the national scene. So I'm going to run through some of the ways that some of these Jim Crow barriers came down here in Silver Spring. I don't have a slide of the Citizens Improvement Association that formed just after World War II with residents of Wheaton, of Lintonsville, and Rockville, but that was genuinely the first civil rights movement in Montgomery County. They banded together in 1946 to study things like the quality of roads, quality of schools, access to sewer and water infrastructure. They looked at the placement of Jim Crow signs in county buildings in Rockville. And then in 1948, they presented the county council with a list of demands that would bring them parity, bring them equity in Montgomery County. Their demands went nowhere, and civil rights initiatives in Montgomery County languished for about a decade until the mid-1950s, and the Supreme Court decision, Brown v. Board, which ruled that schools could no longer be segregated, and things started to change very slowly in Montgomery County. In the late 1950s, the NAACP began doing surveys of county businesses to identify which ones would serve African Americans and which ones wouldn't. One of the tools they used to try to force businesses to be more equitable was to embarrass them in print. So they would produce annual lists of businesses that did and did not discriminate. Things moved slowly between about 1957 and 1961, yet it was a well-known fact in Montgomery County that if you were black, this was not a pleasant place to live. So some of these lists, this is what they look like in the Silver Spring area. Some of these places are still in business, like Chrisfield Seafood on Georgia Avenue. They discriminated, and then things changed. Tasty Diner, again, still in business. Part of the history that isn't very well known yet. Folks patronize these spaces regularly. So how did change come to Montgomery County? It came because the federal government engaged in a couple of things that forced Montgomery County to become more equitable without passing civil rights laws. One of the ways was when the Cold War began, there was this federal policy of dispersion where in order to protect critical federal infrastructure, government offices would move facilities out to the suburbs in the event of a nuclear strike on downtown Washington, D.C. So a lot of federal agencies began moving to suburban Montgomery County to protect their critical infrastructure against a nuclear strike. That was one thing that was going on. Another thing that was going on was there became a very critical shortage of office space in downtown Washington. So agencies like the Department of Labor had to go to places like Silver Spring to find space for their workers. In late 1961, the U.S. Department of Labor announced it was going to move several hundred people to downtown Silver Spring, to this new office building at the corner of Cameron and Georgia in downtown. They realized also that about 200 of the workers were black, and they wouldn't be able to go to lunch or go shopping or do much of anything besides go to work and go home from work. That pushed Montgomery County to pass an open accommodations law, which it did in early 1962. One of the first challenges to that open accommodations law occurred at a place called Crevella's Wayside Inn in downtown Silver Spring, pretty close to the Silver Spring itself. Roscoe Nix, who was a Department of Labor employee and military veteran, decided to go get lunch at Crevella's with some colleagues, and they tried to sit down and be served, and they were told, you have to leave. That episode in early 1962 kicked off almost 4 years of legal challenges and sit-ins that included activism by Julius Hobson, who was the leader of CORE in Washington, D.C., right here in downtown Silver Spring. I challenge you to go find some historical references of these civil rights actions in Silver Spring. Keep Roscoe Nix in mind, because we're going to return to him in a moment. So with open accommodations, African Americans after 1962 could go to restaurants, could go to stores, go to the movies. All of that was legal or mandated by law. Housing was still a critical issue here, though. If you were African American, very often you couldn't buy a home, you couldn't rent an apartment because Jim Crow still had a firm hold on the community. So some activism started to take place in the area of housing right around the same time the Open Accommodations Law was passed. In the early 1960s, an organization called Suburban Maryland Fair Housing was created. And what this organization did is they paired whites with homes and apartments they were willing to sell and rent to African Americans, with African Americans looking for a place to live close to their workplaces because things were spreading out in the suburbs by then. And they started publishing the results of their success stories. So starting in 1963, 1964, there was a concerted effort to get Montgomery County to create open housing that didn't discriminate on the basis of skin color. As all of this was going on, as Montgomery County's leaders were taking the temperature of things, local activist groups were taking things into their own hands. So busing, you think of busing in schools. The United Planning Organization, which was Washington, D.C.'s anti-poverty agency, recognized the problems that blacks living in places like Anacostia and Deanwood faced in trying to get to work at offices in the suburbs. So they created a bus service from Washington, D.C. neighborhoods out to the Silver Spring and Rockville suburbs so that blacks could get to work and get home on a daily basis. Meanwhile, federal agency officials were lobbying the county government to change things because they were having a very difficult time attracting people to work in their agencies and be located in Montgomery County. The county did finally pass an open housing law in 1967. It immediately fell into legal challenge and was blocked by a court because of a technicality. So the county had to re-vote on it in 1968, and it became active the same year that the U.S. Congress passed a fair housing law. Now, it's not an all bad story when it comes to blacks and housing in Montgomery County and neighboring Washington. There were some exceptions to the rule of redlining and mortgage loan discrimination and racial covenants. One of the exceptions was the Perpetual Bank, which was founded in Washington in the 1880s, and which very quickly began courting African Americans as bank customers. What makes the Perpetual Bank significant for Silver Spring's history is that it was the go-to bank for a family of realtors named the Horads. Romeo W. Horad was a Howard University trained lawyer who went to work for the DC Recorder of Deeds, and if you buy or sell property in Washington, you still use the same recording system that he developed in the 1930s. He left the Recorder of Deeds office in 1938 and hung his shingle out as a real estate broker. His mission in life was to pair African American home buyers with previously racially restricted subdivision homes. So working with another realtor, a white man named Rafael Urciolo, they began converting racially restricted row homes and single-family freestanding homes in Washington into black-owned properties. What makes HORAD significant nationally is one of the three cases in the Shelley v. Kramer Supreme Court case in 1948 that overturned the use of racially restrictive covenants came out of one of these properties sold in Bloomingdale in Washington, D.C. So Romeo HORAD had a primary role in breaking down racial barriers nationally, not just locally. HORAD was also one of the founders of that Mutual Improvement Association that first lobbied Montgomery County in the 1940s to bring equity to the black communities. He also became one of the first blacks to run for countywide office when Montgomery County changed its form of government in 1948. But in addition to getting mortgage financing for his customers, the HORADs also used Perpetual for their own purposes. And this is a copy of the mortgage that Romeo HORAD got in 1938 to build this nice brick colonial home on University Boulevard in Wheaton, just across the street from the radio station. Curiously enough, continuing on that theme of erasure and racialized historic preservation, when the Montgomery County Planning Department did its sector plan for Wheaton, not only was that property not mentioned, but they only included a single sentence about African Americans who might have lived in Wheaton around the turn of the 20th century. Had a chance to befriend the HORAD family, and just yesterday I visited Romeo HORAD's surviving son. He's 97, lives in Montgomery County, and he's unfortunately in the last stages of his life. He's in hospice now. But they're an important part of Montgomery County's history, an important part of our national history, and they're almost completely erased locally. Other people aren't erased locally. Here we have Karl Freeman. Freeman came to the Washington area for the first time in the 1920s to begin building single-family homes. He went out to California and decided it would be more profitable to pursue his trade building apartment communities. And when he returned to Washington in the 1950s, he began building apartment communities that he branded Americana throughout, at first, the DC suburbs, and then up the I-95 corridor all the way up to the Philadelphia state line. Freeman was a religious Jew who spent an entire lifetime in real estate, and he's become very prominently mentioned in Montgomery County histories and historic preservation documents. His first headquarters, corporate headquarters in Silver Spring, it was on Fiddler Lane. It's now the Mi Rancho restaurant. His second corporate headquarters in downtown Silver Spring was this brand new office building constructed in the early 1960s. Like the office building where Roscoe Nix and the Department of Labor relocated in 1961, this property has been inventoried by the Montgomery County Planning Department and its Historic Preservation Office. You won't find any mention of civil rights actions here, but you'll find a lot of laudatory language about the building's glass wall architecture, and most significantly, its most notable tenant, Karl Freeman. What it doesn't tell you is that in 1966, civil rights organizations trying to force Montgomery County to create open housing began demonstrating in the street here. So there were massive civil rights demonstrations out in front of this building that were covered nationally, and Freeman was covered nationally because he was one of the most prominent apartment communities in the Washington area. He was also one of the few people willing to make explicit statements to the press, basically saying that there's no way in hell he was going to integrate his apartment communities because he believed they turned into ghettos. Not proven out by the economics or subsequent developments, but nonetheless, Freeman became one of the leading targets of civil rights demonstrations in the Washington metropolitan area. At first, it was a group called ACCESS, the Action Coordinating Committee to End Suburban Segregation, and they picketed Freeman and other apartment communities in Montgomery, Prince George's counties in Maryland and in Arlington, Virginia. As soon as the Beltway was opened for traffic, they also staged a demonstration where they walked around the entire circumference of the Beltway, demanding an end to apartment segregation. And then you can see down here marchers heading to the Summit Hill apartment complex at 16th Street and East West Highway. ACCESS wasn't successful in getting Freeman and the other Jewish developers to look more closely into their own experiences and open up their properties. So a spin-off organization, Jews for Urban Justice, was formed. And they not only picketed the offices and the apartment communities owned and managed by these developers like Freeman, but they also went to the synagogues and protested at the places of worship every weekend to embarrass and force these developers and property owners to open up their properties for black residency. Like the mortgage lending in single-family homes, there are exceptions to the Jim Crow rule that dominated here. One of them involves the former Rosemary Village Apartments, now known as the Barrington. It was built in 1953 as an all-white apartment community, and in 1964, Morris Milgram, who was a pioneer in pushing for open housing throughout the United States, based in Philadelphia, bought the Rosemary Village and immediately began integrating it. By 1970, the Washington Post ran a full-page feature on the community as being one of the most successful examples of integrated housing in the entire metropolitan region, thereby nullifying Freeman and his counterparts' claims that you couldn't integrate housing. So we're up to the late 1960s by this time. You know, Silver Spring was just about to get its open housing law. It had an open accommodations law. Yet, even as we were sending folks towards the moon, we still had a problem here. A Washingtonian magazine reporter went to interview folks in Silver Spring to find out what made this such an attractive community. Why were people moving here in such great numbers from Washington? The leading answer, it's nice, there's no colored here. Number one attribute Silver Spring had in 1967 was it was all white, and African Americans knew that they were not welcome in most parts of Silver Spring. Ebrook Lee, remember him? He's the father of modern Silver Spring. There's a school named for him. There are historical markers to him. Lee left county office in 1948 after the new form of county government was created, and he moved farther out to a horse farm in the upper part of the county, but he kept his hand in local politics. As the rest of the nation and Montgomery County were debating what we call civil rights laws, Ebrook Lee was ranting against what he called anti-white laws. According to Ebrook Lee, integrated housing, integrated places of business would destroy everything that he and his partners and family had strived to build. Ebrook Lee was almost to the end of his life an unapologetic segregationist. So we have this long history of African American presence, we have a long history of segregation, and we have lots of things written and produced about Silver Spring that neither discuss the role segregation played in Silver Spring's history, nor discusses the very important role African Americans played in making this the place that we love to live in and play in. So let's get back to Crevella's Wayside Inn. For decades, blacks in not just Silver Spring, but Bethesda and other parts of the county have tried to get museum spaces created to celebrate their rich, important history. And each time they try to lobby county officials to get a museum space dedicated to their stories, they're continually turned away. So when Montgomery County did that historic resources survey that I showed you the slide of a while back that didn't mention blacks or the role they played here, nor the role Jim Crow played here. They surveyed Crevella's Wayside Restaurant and simply described it as an ordinary concrete block building, not worthy of a second look, no history attached to it. So Montgomery County bought the building in 2006, demolished it in 2009, and rebranded that entire space Bottle Works Lane for some nearby historic bottling works, thereby fully erasing not just this important, nationally important civil rights history, but making it seem like, we have no history here other than white folks who owned bottling plants. And here we have some county officials, now Representative Jamie Raskin, Chris Van Hollen, Nancy Florine, former county executive Ike Leggett, and here we have Humberto Rodriguez, who's sitting with us, the new head of the Silver Spring Urban District, all celebrating this whitewashed, homogenized, false sense of history that Montgomery County likes to create and promote. So what do we have in downtown Silver Spring that tells the story of the black experience and tells the honest story of segregation and Jim Crow? We don't have anything. But we do have about 50 pieces of public art, one of them actually devoted to a historical figure, a man named Norman Lane. Norman Lane was a World War II vet who spent much of the last years of the 20th century wandering homeless through downtown Silver Spring in Northwest Washington, drunk, perhaps suffering from some mental health issues associated with the war. Roscoe Nix, pictured here, had a overlapping history, somewhat similar, but very different in some respects. Norman Lane has a space named for him, Mayor's Lane, just off Georgia Avenue. There's a nice bust and a plaque dedicated to him in Mayor's Lane. And you can Google the mayor of Silver Spring, you'll find all sorts of lovingly written things about Norman Lane. Norman Lane could walk into practically any restaurant in downtown Silver Spring in the 1950s and early 1960s and not just get a seat, but get his meal comped. Roscoe Nix, on the other hand, a military vet, federal employee, who went on to become what civil rights leaders in Montgomery County call one of the pioneers of the civil rights movement in Montgomery County. He left the Department of Labor, went to work for the Department of Justice, leading initiatives in communities that were dealing with transition, dealing with the same types of racial violence that he experienced here in Silver Spring, and trying to mediate and move things forward. He became a member, an early African-American member of the Montgomery County School Board and the president of the NAACP chapter here. You won't find a single reference to Roscoe Nix in downtown Silver Spring, the space that he helped make equal, the place that he helped break the bonds of Jim Crow. There is one recognition of Roscoe Nix in the landscape, sort of close by. It's an elementary school just off of New Hampshire Avenue, pretty close to the Beltway. But in downtown Silver Spring, you have a drunk homeless guy who wandered the streets in the late 20th century, celebrated. Roscoe Nix has been erased. Another way Montgomery County erases and whitewashes its history is through rebranding, again, Bottle Works Lane, and public art initiatives. This is one of 5 panels at the so-called Memory Wall in Acorn Park, next to Acorn Park in South Silver Spring. In the 1990s, Silver Spring had become disinvested, a lot of vacant storefronts, and it was struggling economically and socially. The county, long known for its social engineering practices, decided to help jumpstart things by allowing a department store to build a large new structure in South Silver Spring, and they gave them some zoning exceptions. One of the ways that they mitigated this zoning exception was that the developer had to put in these 5 memory wall panels, depicting Silver Spring at 5 critical points in its history. I'm going to focus on this just one here for a moment, which shows the Silver Spring B&O station in the early 1940s. The artist who created these murals had worked for many years with school children and young adults in Washington, D.C., and she was used to working with people of diverse backgrounds depicting diversity. You know, Washington, D.C. is a fairly heterogeneous southern city. So she used, for the 20th century panels, images in the Montgomery County Historical Society, and for this one depicting the 1940s and the railroad, she used this picture, and you can actually read the correspondence between the artist and Montgomery County officials, where the artist realizes there are just white folks there. She wanted to add a little diversity to it, so she painted in a few people of African descent to create a more diverse, more pleasant view of Silver Spring in the 1940s. The only problem with that is, in the 1940s, it's very unlikely you would have found African Americans standing on a train platform here next to white folks waiting to get on a B&O railroad train. You wouldn't have found them in the 1950s. You wouldn't have found them in the 1960s. Remember all those slides we just went through. So what we have here is a process of erasure by insertion. Silver Spring and Montgomery County have sought to imagineer, rebrand Silver Spring as this place that's always been diverse, inclusive, progressive, when in fact it's been anything but. And it does so through publicly funded, publicly driven initiatives, like the public art program, like the heritage trail signs throughout downtown Silver Spring, like the documentary that depicts Silver Spring's history but marginalizes and does great violence to the Black community here in Lintonsville. All of these efforts are publicly supported, not just by residents like some of the folks in this room, but by government officials like some of the folks in this room. And it's not something that ended in the early 2000s or even in 2010, maybe almost 10 years ago. This is a screen capture from just last week showing properties inventoried in the Maryland Historical Trust inventory of historic properties. Over the decades, historic preservationists have worked in this area doing surveys to identify important places that might be impacted by things like road projects or publicly funded or permitted redevelopment projects or the Purple Line. There's a large body of federal laws that requires historic preservation work. And then you have county historic preservation initiatives like those coming out of the Montgomery County Planning Department that also go out and identify places of historical significance and recommend saving them and creating stewardship programs to ensure that they exist for future generations who might find them important. We are right about there. Oh, actually right about there, sorry. Folks familiar with Lintonsville might wonder, what's that gap? Where's Lintonsville? All of these, you see the dark blue, you see the red, all of the dark blue are inventory forms available at the Maryland Historical Trust that were created from historic subdivisions filed in Montgomery County between the late 19th century and to the present day. All of these are subdivisions. Where's Lintonsville? I overlaid the Lintonsville plat that I showed earlier, filed in 1901. Even today, you can find evidence of the erasure that marginalizes and excludes people of color in this very diverse, progressive, and liberal community that we call home. So let's get back to the tracks and some of the things that make Lintonsville truly special and unlike other places in Silver Spring. Here we're looking at the Talbot Avenue Bridge, which was built by the B&O Railroad in 1918 to replace an earlier wood bridge constructed about 15 years earlier. The bridge itself was constructed from a recycled turntable. I don't have a slide showing the fancy animation, but basically imagine this center span inverted and narrower. That was placed on a turntable structure in a roundhouse or rail yard where work was done on railroad engines. So the B&O hauled that down from a rail yard in Martinsburg, West Virginia, turned it over and spanned the railroad tracks connecting the Sundown suburb of Silver Spring and Lintonsville. the other side of the tracks, the African-American community here. The bridge itself, which is slated for demolition in less than a month, quickly became not just connective tissue connecting the Sundown Suburb with the African-American hamlet, but it also became contested space. For decades, residents in the North Woodside neighborhoods and some of the other neighborhoods on the other side of the bridge not just stigmatized Lintonsville, but went to extreme lengths to try and close off their communities to prevent people from Lintonsville driving through their streets. This is a front page of a Montgomery County Black newspaper from 1996 showing an example of Lintonsville residents resisting efforts to not just close the bridge, but to isolate them and to perpetuate this racialized and very segregated use of space here. So we've heard a little bit about urban renewal. We've heard some about encroachment by white subdivisions. We've heard railroads, all these things that have eaten away at Lintonsville over the past century. So there are very few people still living in Lintonsville who can trace their ancestry back to the turn of the 20th century when Lintonsville was a very proud, very resilient Black community. These processes have disintegrated and eroded Lintonsville in the same way that they've eroded Black communities throughout North America, whether it's Southwest Washington, West Philadelphia, Detroit, Chicago, New York. The same processes that led to displacement and disintegration elsewhere were active here, in this bridge closure or attempt to close the bridge, first in 1996 and then ultimately now in the 21st century, is part of that same process of erasure, of the attempt to marginalize, stigmatize, and dispense with people who are inconvenient. So the Purple Line, going to be a wonderful new rail connection for Bethesda, linking Bethesda with Silver Spring and College Park, theoretically taking traffic off of the roads, making it easier for people to get to work, to get home. Going to bring all this wonderful equitable development to Montgomery and Prince George's County, in theory. I'm not going to get into all of the things that I think are problematic with the Purple Line, but I am going to focus on the Talbot Avenue Bridge. So federal agencies have to identify historic properties, places that are either currently listed in the National Register of Historic Places or are eligible for listing in the National Register of Historic Places. And if they find properties that meet those criteria, they have to determine if a project like the Purple Line light rail is going to adversely affect them. In other words, change the qualities that make them historically significant. And those changes can be physical changes that render them illegible, or full demolition, like what's going to happen with the Talbot Avenue Bridge. So architectural historians and planners with the state of Maryland came through the area and looked at the Talbot Avenue Bridge, looked at an archaeologist's inventory form for the bridge that only discussed its historical associations with the B&O Railroad, and they determined that, yep, the bridge is eligible for listing in the National Register, but it's only eligible, only historically significant, because it's an engineering structure associated with the railroad. None of the social history attached to Lintonsville or to Jim Crow segregation or anything else affiliated with that bridge other than its old metal and wood was important to the people who did the planning for the Purple Line. So because you have this important historic structure, only important for its engineering, they came up with a way to resolve the adverse effect, the demolition. They were going to send some historians out, take some pictures, write up a new inventory form that updates the archaeologist one done in the 1990s, call it good, and demolish the bridge. And that's exactly what they did. Then a pesky historian came along and started asking questions here in Lintonsville and in Rosemary Hills, and found out that the bridge is a little more important than just some old metal and wood. So the state of Maryland, in its wisdom, decided, let's try and smooth things over. Let's do a little more whitewashing here. We're not going to preserve the bridge and maintain that tangible link that people in Lintonsville lovingly recall as their only connection to downtown Washington, to stores in Silver Spring, and to places of work. let's whitewash it by creating some public art. Let's take those girders, stick them next to a new Purple Line station, and affix some cute paintings and photographs. Well, that's really nice, but it still doesn't leave the bridge in place, still doesn't leave people still living in Lintonsville, their descendants, their extended families, and anyone else who might have an interest in not just seeing that physical piece of history, but experiencing it in situ, literally bridging the other side of the tracks. Instead, the state of Maryland and Montgomery County is going to give us this. So, that's the standard operating procedure in historic preservation. Fortunately, the folks in Lintonsville, North Woodside, and Rosemary Hills had different ideas. So as this more rich history of the bridge and the communities became more widely known, they decided to take things into their own hands. So last year, they threw a 100th birthday party for the bridge. So that thing called mitigation, where they resolve the adverse effects. The state's approach to mitigation was sending historians out who used boilerplate language, who wrote something that wouldn't pass muster in a college history or historic preservation class. The residents here decided they were going to do a little different kind of mitigation, something that actually engages the community, that raises awareness of history, and that has a more enduring impact on the communities. So last September, they threw a little party that attracted about 300 people to the bridge. There was music. There were people telling about their experiences living in the neighborhoods touched by the bridge, and it was quite a festive, memorable event. And it's something that will complement the mitigation done by the state. There are some other things that'll complement the state's mitigation that'll become publicly known in the coming months. But this is the community's effort to reclaim their history and say, this is how we want to remember our bridge and celebrate it. One of the most amazing things that happened during this centennial celebration is that not only did the white communities on the other side of the tracks confront its racial history and seek ways to remedy it, but they did it in a very public way. So David Cox, the president of the Civic Association on the other side of the bridge, you can see up here one of the typical racial covenants from his neighborhood. For the purpose of sanitation and health, neither the said party of the second part, nor their heirs or assigns shall or will sell or lease the said land to anyone of a race whose death rate is at a higher percentage than the white race, basically no blacks allowed, unless you're a servant. His neighborhood association board of directors passed unanimously a resolution renouncing the racial restrictive covenants and then pledging to work more closely with the residents of Lintonsville. Now, that's unheard of. Maybe a handful of communities throughout the United States have actually taken that initiative and used an approach that some call a truth and reconciliation model to not just confront the past and the present and try to make a better future. And the folks here in Lintonsville and the neighboring neighborhoods actually did that. After the centennial celebration, the party wasn't over yet. There was a little break. And the same folks who threw the bridge party had a lantern walk. Again, music, community engagement, and then an opportunity to make lanterns, actually in this room, during the afternoon one Saturday. And then at sunset, the lanterns were carried from the Lintonsville side across the bridge through North Woodside and then back to Lintonsville. And I understand that's going to be an annual event. We'll see how well that goes. But back to you have some good in the story, but there's still a whole lot of bad. In the 1960s and 1970s, the change that Montgomery County wanted to bring to Lintonsville was called urban renewal. In the 21st century, it's called suburban retrofitting. So we have some examples of some county documents here. The first two related to the urban renewal processes that played out here in the 1960s and 1970s. And then the Greater Lintonsville Sector Plan, which again minimized and reduced and did great violence to the African Americans who call this place home and who called this place home. and the greater Lintonsville sector plan design guidelines, which will bring tremendous change to this area and fully achieve the vision that that real estate evaluator had in 1923 when he said this was prime land for country estates and upscale redevelopment. So the erasure program, first conceived a century ago, is going to come full circle when the greater Lintonsville sector plan is fully realized, when the purple line brings in transit-oriented development and continues to displace people. There are people already feeling rent pressures in some of the apartment communities. There are individuals who are starting to move away from this particular area because the Talbot Avenue Bridge won't be walkable for observant Jews. A whole host of things are changing here as a result of this suburban retrofitting that will finish the program. And as we talk about finishing programs, I want to mention the finish of my program here. We returned to Silver Spring in 2014, and I started doing the research that leads me to do talks like this. One of the reasons that I started doing the research and I started becoming active in community organizations around anti-racism and trying to unerase some of the damage done by the county, done by the historical societies and others, was so that Silver Spring wouldn't turn into Decatur, Georgia. Unfortunately, I was a little too late. Silver Spring is already Decatur, Georgia. You can see this memory wall constructed along the edge of those segregation-era schools in Decatur, Georgia, that purports to tell the history of the Black community, which, by the way, after I started intensifying my research into that community, many longtime Black residents of Decatur contacted me by phone and email to tell me that the history presented here isn't the history they know. And then we have Silver Spring, Maryland, with one of the artist renderings of what's going to happen with those girders after the bridge is demolished next month and placed along the Capitol Crescent Trail, fully realizing the erasure of Lintonsville, the Black experience, and Jim Crow segregation. Thank you.